The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, present the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. In this session, U.S.-German relationships, why they're grim, and how we can make them worse. We hear from Brigham Young University's Dr. Wade Jacoby. 1 year on, how can we understand the Trump administration and transatlantic relations? Spoiler alert, they're not great, but they do have the potential to get much worse. This talk covers a range of transatlantic issues, including the durability of the liberal international order, the U.S. burden-sharing debate, and the global economy.
Our first speaker today is Wade Jacoby. He is a native of Palmer, Alaska, and even after moving to Washington State, he was able to spend a few summers working on the Yukon River fishing industry as a tender operator in the king and chum fisheries. He used to know where all the sandbars were between Mountain Village and Alacanak. One hopes not from personal contact, though. After college, he played semi-pro football in Germany for 2 seasons, which I hope he will tell us more about. In Utah, he likes fly fishing, elk hunting, and canyoneering, and he is slightly disappointed not to be invited to Juneau during the salmon run, a grave faux pas for which we sincerely apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wade Jacoby.
Thanks very much. The title of my talk is something like U.S.-German relations, why they're grim and how we can make them worse. And I want to kind of go through both aspects of this. And I want to do it from the fairly obvious background position that of having Donald Trump in office and the difficulties that brings to what we call transatlantic relations. I didn't vote for Trump, but I've got a lot of family members who did. And one of the things that we talked about in the fall when the election was up was this idea that, American politics has gotten bad enough. How much worse can it really get? And this was a perspective that I think the president, the candidate, and then president himself has encouraged. He would sometimes say to folks, what do you got to lose? And the implicit answer was nothing. You don't have anything to lose. Things can only go up from here. I teach comparative politics at BYU, which means I spend a lot of time talking about countries outside the United States. And let me tell you, folks, there's a lot of ways in which things can get worse. Sitting in this beautiful place on this beautiful day in a terrific institution of higher education, talking about these things, there's a long way to go down. And people who think that things can't get worse are just not paying attention. So what I want to talk about today is the transatlantic relationship and where I think we stand and where things might be going, and give you a couple of ways to think about this. I want to focus on Germany, which is arguably our key ally in Europe these days. You could make a case for the French, you could make a case for the British. I'll make a case today that Germany is really an important bilateral relationship. But a lot of what I say, you could kind of think about, this sort of stands for the broader American-European relationship. It's not just a Germany thing. So let me start with the first of the two parts. Why are German-American relations kind of grim right now? Why is the relationship with the U.S. bad? What kind of country is Germany, and why is it struggling with the U.S. under a Trump presidency? So I like to talk about Germany as a combination of 4 things. You may find this a little cryptic, but I hope it's memorable enough. Germans are norm-abiding, security-exposed, trade-dependent, status quo power. Those 4 things I think are critical. Norm-abiding, we talked about that last. So I'll go through each of those. Norm-abiding, security-exposed, trade-dependent, status quo power. We talked about, so Kurt gave a great lecture last night on the norm-abiding part. This idea that the country should follow rules. They should follow practices. His formulation was markets need rules, which is something some Americans frankly don't believe. They think markets should be totally free. Germans don't believe that for a second. They have an intellectual tradition that not only do countries and democracies need constitutions, but markets need constitutions as well. And some of this comes from their totalitarian past, for sure. This idea that, in the past, we have had German leaders who have used law, used rules instrumentally as tools of their power. And we had judges that went along with that essentially blessed that kind of lawmaking. And these were lawless states because they were using law instrumentally. And we want, in the post-war period, so goes the story, to make Germany what the Germans call a Rechtsstaat, a state of laws. And you can find this in various different ways. One of the best ways is the Constitution. If you think about it from an American perspective, the German Constitution is kind of cool. It has all 10 of our Bill of Rights, and then it has 10 more on top of it. There's 20 articles in the first part of the German Constitution that include things like the freedom to practice your profession without constraint by the state. That was routinely violated in East Germany. It was violated in the Nazi period. You're free to practice your job. The inviolability of the home. The state cannot come into your home without your permission in certain very important legal ways. The freedom of movement, the right to asylum. These are constitutional, deeply anchored rights in German law. And the 20th is in some ways the best of all. It's the right of rebellion. Every German has the right to rebel against any power seeking to undermine the Constitution, including those other 19 rights that were just listed. So Germany is serious about law. And Germany is part of a European Union that is also, I think, fairly serious about law. The EU is an incredibly legalistic institution. And they think in terms of the legal foundation, the norms that broadly shape international behavior. The EU has this thing called the single market, where you've got essentially now, as long as the UK is still, about 500 million consumers that are working along a set of laws that regulate every product and service you can imagine. And so law is important. Second point here, laws and norms always encapsulate some idea of power. So we write laws around the practices that we prefer. And you know this from the time when you were a little kid and you played sandlot baseball or pickup basketball. You're always trying to tweak the laws to protect you, right? If you're not a good batter, there was a kid in our neighborhood who insisted that the rule be if you hit a pop fly, you get one more chance. That's a rule that made that kid happy, and we wanted that kid to play, so we changed our rules. If you hit a pop fly in the first swing, you get another chance. The Germans have lots of laws that they've thought carefully about. They've tried to encode their preferences in a legal international order, the stuff that Kurt was talking about last night. That whole liberal international order, what he called embedded liberalism, is indeed a big piece of that. And the important thing, I think, or one important thing here, is that when the Germans have an outcome that they don't like, but it's legal, they live with it anyway. That's part of what it means to be in the European Union. Sometimes you get outvoted. The EU has a thing called qualified majority voting, which means if there's a qualified majority that's for this, and we're against it, and we get outvoted, we live with it. And that's one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin and Russia's behavior since 2014 has been so difficult for German foreign policy. Here's a country that has now blatantly broken international law. And Germany feels itself to be highly dependent upon these norms and rules, that it can't do business without a certain confidence that these rules are going to be followed by everybody. So this brings us then to Donald Trump. From this mindset, Trump's a big challenge. He's a guy who doesn't really seem, from the German perspective, to understand what the norms are. And when he learns about the norms, his gut instinct is to say something like, well, I don't like the way the U.S. is being treated by those rules. If that's what's normal, then maybe I should be critical of those underlying norms. This is highly disorienting for German foreign policy. I call it the Mar-a-Lago syllogism. If I don't like what's been going on, I'm going to change what's going on. After all, things can't get any worse, right? And the problem is that right now we're breaking international norms that are not well understood. So the perspective from Germany is the United States is changing, or at least challenging, these international norms, And the guy in charge doesn't seem to really understand what those norms were in the first place. So from a German perspective, that's very problematic. A country that is a norm-abiding country does not like it when we get into a world in which those norms get radically challenged. So that's point number one. So norm-abiding, and then the second one I said was security exposed. So Germany is security exposed, which means it can't really manage its own security, and it has security challenges. Okay, well that's not terribly shocking, you say. Aren't most countries security exposed? Can't most countries anticipate having a real headache if they had to deal with their potential enemies by themselves? And here I think, we have to pay attention to what a geographically happy situation we Americans find ourselves in. Because it's really hard from an American mindset to really think your way into a European mindset about security. We have for 200 years been surrounded by saltwater, armadillos, and moose. We just don't have security problems because of our physical location. And as a consequence, it's super hard for Americans to think their way into European intuitions about security dilemmas that they face. They live in a really bad neighborhood. And it has been a bad neighborhood for a long time. Now it's been relatively quiet for a while, for sure. But think about, have you ever seen one of those maps that shows European borders over time? You can find dozens of them on YouTube. You sort of click on arbitrarily the year 1000 or something like that, and a bunch of countries you don't recognize will pop up. And then as the clip plays, you'll see countries come and go, get bigger and smaller. Spain and Portugal will show up in the 15th century, and then France, and then the United Kingdom. But then a lot of other stuff is really unfamiliar. Everywhere in Central Europe, the boundaries are changing at a very high rate of speed. Lithuania will be like this big, and then it'll go all the way to the Black Sea, and then it disappears again. I mean, that's a dizzying perspective that most Americans find it really tough to understand, just how complicated the geopolitics of Europe are. So Germany is in a tough neighborhood. What does Germany do about this? The answer is not a whole lot. Their defense spending is about 1.2% of GDP. If you know NATO, there used to be an idea that you'd spend 3% of GDP on defense. That got dropped to 2% of GDP on defense. The Germans are just over half of that, 1.2%. They've got an army of 180,000 in the Bundeswehr, all in, sailors, soldiers, airmen, everything. 30,000 more in reserves. They're spending $40 billion a year on defense. It sort of squeaks into the top 10 armies in the world in terms of spending. It's a semi-serious military. And it's got arguably not a lot of security problems that it's had to deal with over the last little while. And this has been the big debate in America for a long time. Why won't the Europeans spend more on defense? Why are we spending so much? Why are we in America spending $400 billion a year to protect the richest people in the world from nobody? That was the question that Americans would often ask in this defense spending debate. And now the answer is, well, Russia looks like it's back. It looks like it's not nobody anymore. We've got a European power, Russia, which has taken a big chunk of territory from another European country in violation of these international norms. And believe me, Germans are focused on this. They see it. To an extent, they're greatly worried about it. And President Trump opens a complicated flank for the Germans on this because of his comments about NATO, in particular during the campaign. He sort of softened that a bit as president, but he spoke often about how he wanted to see this free riding, as he called it, ending. And Mia Cross later will talk a lot more about defense things, but I think it's enough for me to say that this has made the Germans nervous. But here's the problem, folks. A lot of Germans would say, voters, German elites would say, yeah, we should probably do more on defense. But we don't want to do more on defense if it looks like to our voters we're kowtowing to this American president. So even the folks who want to spend more on defense in Germany feel a little bit painted into a corner. They know that they're exposed politically if they start doing this because they feel like voters will feel like they're only doing it because Trump made them do it, something like that. Now the Grand Coalition in Berlin, this new government that you probably saw was finally put together a couple of weeks ago, has published a coalition treaty, which is basically two parties' ways of sort of making these pinky promises and then writing them all down and telling voters what they're going to do and not going to do. And on the defense section, it's kind of embarrassingly thin. What they basically say is we're going to increase defense spending and development spending in a 1-to-1 ratio. This is an interesting formula because the Social Democrats were hammering the Christian Democrats for being Trump's lackeys, wanting to raise the defense budget. The Christian Democrats were saying, no, there are good reasons to spend more on defense. We want to do this for our own reasons. And the Social Democrats said, look, if you want to make that clear, let's make defense spending only go up if we're willing to also increase development spending. And so that's the formula that they've hit on. And the likelihood would be that that agreement, which is struck now in 2018, we would expect that to hold throughout this legislative period, which is to say 4 more years. What the treaty does not say is that Germany will make it to 2% by 2024. I mean, you could say, well, 2024 is outside the legislative period. They shouldn't be talking that far down the road. But honestly, you know, Merkel had made a big deal out of saying, look, we're going to get to 2%. We're at 1.2%. We're going to get to 2% by 2024. That would have been the 10-year anniversary of the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. So it was a very symbolic date in a way. We're not going to get there overnight, but we're going to get there. This document no longer makes that claim. And so that feels to a lot of people like maybe a concession that's not going to happen. Okay, so it's not likely that Germany will be able or willing to spend what Trump has asked for and what many others have asked for as well. So that's the second part. Third part, trade dependent. Germany is a norm-abiding, security-exposed, trade-dependent status quo power. Germany thinks of itself as an export champion. They're proud of this. They'll often, their big boulevard newspaper, the kind of equivalent of USA Today, is often sort of trumpeting, we won again, we're the leading export country in the world, and look, there's only 80 million of us. So there's a lot of Germans who spend a lot of time patting themselves on the back for Germany's superior export performance. And of course, this grates at Trump like almost nothing else. So we need to talk about that a bit. And this is the audience participation part of the talk. Let's imagine that you were going to open a new gift shop in Juneau, Alaska. And you wanted to be able to sell gifts. What are some variables you're going to need to worry about as you open this gift shop? You know, you're going to think about the quality of what's that?
Location.
Location. Where are you going to put it in town? Excellent. Thank you. Customers. Where are they coming from? Who are they? How much money do they have?
Somebody
what else?
Already selling the stuff I want to see.
Exactly. What's the competition look like? Supply. How much cool stuff can I get to sell, right? All these kinds of, what are my costs going to be like? What's my labor cost? What's my rent going to be? So they're the kind of questions that anybody would ask anywhere. But in Juneau, Alaska, there's another variable that matters a great deal. And what is that variable? Shipping, right? The cruise ship, right? The demand side of it. That's really what drives so much of, like, everybody understands that you can control all of these variables. But if the cruise ships stop coming, how long is your gift shop going to stay open, or whatever it is you're selling, your restaurant or whatever? The Germans have never really figured this out, which they know this, but it's in their interest not to really understand this. This is the dirty secret of the German economy, which I will try to explain now. The Germans try to pretend like the cruise ships don't really matter. What really matters is the unbelievable quality of German engineering. We make nice cars. Man, our cars are good. And if you want to understand why we've got an 8% current account surplus, have I showed you our cars yet? These cars are fantastic. It's like a Mercedes S-Class is carved out of a piece of whale ivory or something like that, right? This is what's happened. Why do we prosper in international markets? Because our stuff is the best. The problem is German engineering's been good for a long time. So Germany had a big current account surplus since 2003. How do you explain a change with a constant? If the engineering's always been high quality, why haven't you had a current account surplus forever? Why haven't you had a current account plus since Charlemagne? But you haven't. It's because of 2003. We can see it in the figures very, very clearly. The Germans are a combination of confused and dishonest about this. So what is going on? Well, what's going on is a big demand side part of the equation. Any economy, doesn't matter if it's Germans or anybody else, has three sources of growth: consumption, investment, and net exports. For most countries, most of the time, your consumption is your big share of it, investment's a medium-sized share, and your net trade is a smaller piece of it, right? The Germans have repressed domestic consumption through policy, and they have stopped investing for kind of obvious reasons that they don't have enough money to buy their own stuff, and so they're blowing up export sales as a way to compensate for that. They're leaning on external demand in a very, very big way. And by the way, they're not the only ones. The Chinese have been doing this, the Koreans have been doing this, the Taiwanese have been doing this, and the Germans are teaching the rest of the Europeans to do it well. And the United States is getting frustrated with this. Trump, in his characteristically inarticulate way, says, I don't see very many Chevys outside of luxury homes in Germany. And the Germans' answer is, you should make better cars. Right? This is the dumbest debate since taste great, less filling. You remember the old Miller beer commercials? In fact, this might be a dumber debate. The problem is that this is not really a world in which trade is driven by engineering quality and price alone. It's driven, and this is the weird thing, it's driven by capital flows, or it's at least facilitated by capital flows. And that's the part that gets really hard for people to sort out. And the German government, A, understands this is complicated, and B, doesn't want to come clean on this, and as a consequence, tends to blame everybody else for things like, why don't you guys save more? You should save more. You know, why don't you guys make better cars? We get stuck in these endless policy debates, and in a way, Trump is kind of a perfect storm for them. On the one hand, it's like you can almost see the people in the Ministry of Finance saying, we would so love if this whole export debate would go away. We like the way things are right now. They're working for us. Labor markets are tight. Wage growth is there. It's not great, but it's there. We're in pretty good shape compared to the rest of the world. If we could just discredit this idea that our export surpluses are a problem, everything would be great. The problem is that Trump comes along and he presents him with a tough choice. On the one hand, maybe they could discredit him by saying, right, he's saying all of these things are a problem, Germany's export surplus, and if people don't like Trump and don't believe him, maybe they will not believe his message. On the other hand, that's risky because they have the other European countries that have the same kind of worries about what Germany is doing. Okay, so the explanation basically, and we can go into this more in the Q&A if you'd like to, is that starting in the early 2000s, Germany's policy at home shifts. That shift moves income from those who spend, which are poorer people, to those who save, the ones who are better off. As Germany's savings rise, especially corporate savings, its investment falls. The reason its investment falls, you could think of it this way. Why would companies invest in German production for home consumption if consumption's going down? Instead, they send that capital abroad. When that capital goes abroad, only a few things can happen. First of all, when you have excess savings in one part of any global system, and that savings flows somewhere else, you have to have fewer savings somewhere else. All savings are invested, according to macroeconomists, and I think the data for this is unambiguous. It's right. So if one country's saving a lot and not investing, those savings have to go somewhere. Where do they go? First they went to Eastern Europe. Then they went to Southern Europe. Then they came to the United States. All three of those areas have had to deal with the consequences of excess German capital. The United States is in a particularly tricky position because for, to me, somewhat mysterious reasons, we believe that having the rest of the world's capital flow into us is a good thing for us. What it really does is help if we can invest it wisely. That's the win-win scenario. That's what we hope happens. But when money comes in that we cannot invest wisely, and when it come in, it could come to Eastern Europe, it could come into Latvia, Estonia, it could come into Greece and Spain and Portugal, it could come into the United States. If it comes in and we don't invest it productively, we will not be able, by definition, to pay back the principal and the interest. We'll have a hard time servicing those debts. When that money comes in as extra savings from abroad, our savings will decline. It must decline. It has to decline. How does it decline? There's two great ways of doing this. One is unfortunately not so sustainable. That's to go on a buying spree. You can spend a lot of money in your credit card. You can run up your debt. And as a consequence, you're unsaving. You are getting indebted. That's the opposite of saving. So that can bring American savings rates down, or East European savings rates down, or Greek savings rates down. That'll happen to all of these countries. The other thing, unfortunately, that's not sustainable because eventually you can't get more credit and so you can't buy any more stuff. The other way to get your savings rates down, and this works every time, is unemployment. Because unemployment, I'm not working, I have no job, but I gotta have food and I gotta have a place to live. When I pay for those things, my savings goes down as well. And unemployment is quite durable. Unemployment works until prices fall far enough that that country becomes competitive again in international markets. So the Germans don't want to explain this to anybody. Trump doesn't understand it. There's a dialogue of the deaf in American trade policy. The fundamental issues are not really trade issues. The fundamental issues are capital flow issues, but they're complicated. They can't be explained in a bumper sticker. They can't be explained in 14 seconds on Fox News. And so it's really hard to sort of make sense of all this. So that's the third part of the story. Germany is a trade-dependent country, and it's trying to figure out if there's going to be a trade war. And it knows that if there's a trade war, it's going to lose. It's kind of funny. There are some German economists who try to pretend that somehow Germany will come out of a trade war better off than the United States. I think the historical record on this is very poor. Surplus countries in trade wars do not do well. So I think the Germans are understandably very, very nervous about Trump's economic policy, and they're being confronted with a choice right now. Trump is basically saying, look, the Chinese are cheating and everybody knows it. You Europeans, why don't you gang up with us on the Chinese? I think I saw some water over here. I think it's time for me to... So has this already been like pre-poured? Is that...
No, that looks like somebody else has already used it.
All right, all right. I thought that was a little bit too...
Convenient.
Yeah, a little bit too cultivated to add the water already like halfway pre-poured. German water. So where was I? The Chinese, right? So the bargain that may be on offer, we don't know, but Robert Lighthizer, the president's chief trade thinker, has certainly talked this way in the past. Maybe what the Europeans could do is work with the United States to stop some of these really abusive Chinese trade practices, the theft of technology, leaning on FDI, people basically restricting folks from being able to repatriate profits, all kinds of stuff that the Europeans and the Germans really, really, really don't like. But again, it's the same dilemma as I kind of pointed to before. Do they really want to ally with Trump when they know he's hell-bent on upending an international system that's really worked well for the Germans? And the answer for the most part is no. No. We would also like the Chinese to stop doing what they're doing, but if the cost of that is to throw in with the Trump trade plan, we find that too unpredictable, too wrong-headed, too likely to end in a global trade war instead of just a regional trade war. So that's also an unhappy world for them. All right, last point of these, the sort of diagnosis. Status quo power. I can be quicker here. Germany is basically a status quo power. It doesn't want a revolution. It likes the system that it helped build. Thank you, Carl.
Different cup, I swear.
Wow, it makes me want to forgive you those terrible jokes. Germany doesn't want a revolution. It likes the system. It helped build the system. An increasingly norm-driven world in which free trade is promoted while capital flows are not really discussed, and in which an indifferent German commitment to defense is seen as good enough. Germans love that world. That's their happy spot. And Trump says that world's going away. For all these reasons, Germany is freaking out because it can't find a plausible way to respond to these initiatives on the part of the president. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. Why Germany is frustrated, having a difficult time with this presidency. The second part, how can we make it worse? The paradox here is that the Obama team had relatively close relations with Germany while all of these tensions simmered under the surface. These tensions over NATO, spending, over trade, they were all there. So how did the Obama people manage all this? I like to think the 3 C's, climate, Crimea, and chemistry. Basically, on climate, Obama had a really difficult time with Congress, and he was looking for European partners with whom he could continue to make what he saw as forward progress on climate. On Crimea, I think that in 2014, when the Russians invaded, this was a time for general rethinking in the Obama White House, in which the European relationship was upgraded in some ways, in which a great deal of respect was given between the Obama White House, national security team in particular, and the Merkel chancellorship. They came to see Merkel as a really reliable partner. And then the third part is then this chemistry personal chemistry between Obama and Merkel. They liked each other. I had one of Obama's closest advisors say he thought his relationship with Merkel was closer than with any woman outside of his wife and daughters. They trusted one another. They did a lot of difficult business together. And they felt, I think they came to feel, they did not feel initially, but they came to feel like they were very much on the same team and getting a lot of big global problems addressed, not under control, but addressed. So if those are the 3 C's, I think once Trump comes along, all 3 of these pillars kind of fall apart. I call this the 3 Ps. First is Paris. Trump says we're not going to stick in the Paris Accords, so climate's done. And then Putin. Trump has apparently this hard to understand relationship with the Russian president, but he doesn't seem to want to really put very much pressure on. There have been some renewed sanctions, but as people constantly comment, what is it with Putin and the president? And the third, pardon me, but Trump is just a prick. And I don't think Merkel can work with him. She finds it extremely difficult. So the relationship has been extraordinarily hard for the two. I don't know much about how President Trump feels about it, but I think that it's clear from the Merkel chancellery that they find this an extraordinarily hard relationship to manage. So, okay. Trump is not doing all this for no reason. He's doing it because a big chunk of his base really wants him to sock it to foreigners. They haven't had a pay raise since 1982, and they're not happy, and Trump obliges this. From a German point of view, he combines basically the ethics of a shark fin trader with the personal charm of the hillside strangler. They don't like this guy. They don't like anything about him, and yet they've got to work with him somehow. Germany has its own surging populism, which means there isn't enough market share left for the 2 big parties to have normal coalitions. And for the third time in 4 governments, the 2 big parties have to work together in what's called a grand coalition. Voters hate this. The parties hate this. The media hates this. Only the populists like this because they get to throw apples basically at the people in power. In this combination, might it be possible, you ask me, for things to get worse? Why, yes, it just might. So how could we make things worse? I want to end with not a set of predictions, but some reminders of the big problems out there that might bring this relationship even lower. And by implication, many of these things affect not just U.S.-German relations, but U.S.-European relations too. So first on norms. Europe could attack the U.S. on the digital giants, Apple, Google, Facebook. There are dueling norms of technology here and how to regulate it. Basically, Americans say, with these new economy firms, we don't really know what they are, but they're not they're not IBM, certainly not General Motors. We're not going to regulate them very heavily. Sometime we'll figure out what to do with them, but they're, if not exactly unicorns, at least unusual. We're not going to try to make them be so we're not going to tax them, for example. For a very long time, we're just not going to tax these guys. That's not the way Europeans see this. Europeans say, and especially Germans, look, they're a company. They have to be taxed, or they have to follow these rules. They can't say we're a special kind of industry, a different kind of company, and therefore we're outside of the normal rules. Again, back to this whole rule-based notion. So that's one area you should definitely keep your eye on. A second area where the norms could really clash is on the notion of what is a democracy. Here, the German issue is we're watching our EU partners in Hungary and Poland break European norms of democracy. They're fiddling with the media, fiddling with their constitutional courts, messing with property, messing with legal rights in ways that we would not have let them into the European Union if we knew they were going to do these things. But now they're in. What do? One answer is try to kick them out. That's not the leading answer, but it is an option. And if the EU moves to try to push in some way Poland and or Hungary out of the EU, which is not impossible, it would probably feel obliged to distance itself from a Trump-led United States of America at the same time. So that's something to keep an eye on. What will happen with Poland and Hungary? A third area of norms, I think, is this issue of data. Germans have, for, again, good historical reasons, a real worry about the state having access to too much data. In the United States, we tend to worry more about private companies having our data. In Germany, they worry more about the state having the data, but there's also a concern that the companies would have too much. And this leads to very strong differences of opinion with the United States, including on things like Edward Snowden. Snowden's kind of a hero in much of Germany. Germans see him as the kind of folk hero who made the American national security state pay attention to law. And they tend to elide the very strong possibility that Edward Snowden was working for Russia from the start. I mean, it seems to me unlikely to have been an accident that this guy got asylum in Moscow as quickly as he did. And so again, major tensions between the United States and Europe over questions of privacy, data protection. So that's the norm area. On security, I've already said that Germany looks unlikely to spend what Trump is demanding that they spend. So one thing that worries me, and I think you should keep your eye on, is to what extent do the anti-American voices in Germany, and there are some, flare up over this issue. There are some in the Social Democratic Party for sure. The Christian Socialists in Bavaria have a fair number of people who don't like the United States. But the real big one is this new party, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD. These folks are, first of all, strongly financed by Russia, but they represent a genuine slice of the German opinion on how to rescue the Eurozone, or if to rescue the Eurozone, what to do about the Euro. And there is a very, very strong anti-American element in this party. This party is now the largest opposition party in the Bundestag, and being the largest opposition party gives you a lot of privileges in terms of speaking and public visibility. One possibility is that this inexperienced party will kind of fall on its face, and that might be the leading expectation. That's probably what will happen. But as they do that, it's also possible that they will start to embellish or use a lot of anti-American slogans to try to raise their own profile, or just as they try to find their voice as a major opposition party. So that, I think, is something to be quite concerned about. Another piece of this is what I call social estrangement. American travel to Germany is down, German travel to America is down. How much does that matter? I don't know yet. It's, again, something to keep your eye on. But when we don't know one another, when we don't get out and visit other people, get to see what their situation is, misunderstandings become much easier. They get bigger. They become more difficult to unravel. And I think that this sharp decline in European travel to America is something that I'm concerned about. And finally, on security, I would say it's possible that the U.S. will simply break the Iran treaty. You know, John Bolton has now been announced as the new national security advisor, taking over from McMaster. There's been a constant kind of, to the extent that we've tried to reassure our European friends about American foreign policy, the usual line has been, don't worry about the president, look at the second line people. General Kelly knows what he's doing, McMaster knows what he's doing. These are experienced U.S. foreign policy hands. They know what's going on. As these people leave one by one and replaced with, shall we say, lesser known people in some cases, but in Bolton's case, perhaps more widely known people, this is not exactly reassuring for the transatlanticists. And you know, Bolton's pretty steady interpretation of the Iran treaty was it was a disaster for American national security, should never have been signed. And this runs essentially antithetical to the center of European public opinion, certainly German opinion, that this treaty with an Iranian regime, however troublesome they are, is better than its absence. And they fully intend to see it continued. So that's another real important potential fracture point. And finally, on trade, here the big worry is that Germany is teaching the rest of Europe how to do this. The European Union used to have essentially current account surpluses in some countries and deficits in other countries. And if you summed the surplus and deficits together, the entire European monetary union was in rough balance with the rest of the world. So the rest of the world could look at, and Germans often said this, we know that our 8% surplus is really big and annoys you, but remember, the British run a big current account deficit, so together, we're kind of like neutral. That's going away, because as more and more European countries figure this out, and figure out how difficult these capital inflows can be for them to manage, especially when they don't have a strong central bank that can do the kind of macroprudential supervision that you need for these capital inflows, the entire European monetary union is going into surplus. They're headed for about 4% right now. 4% of a much bigger figure than the 8% of German GDP. So to the extent that that continues, that is a train wreck waiting to happen. And the Europeans have to understand that they cannot sustain 4% of European GDP current account surplus for the rest of the world. It's going to lead to a lot of conflict. So the Germans need to take this seriously, and I'm worried that they're not. All right, to close, I don't dwell on the problems because the problems are all that we have. To go back to the title of the conference, these are our allies, folks. We do have things that bind us. I consider the European countries to be our most important allies, and I consider the Germans to be truly important allies of the United States of America. So I dwell on the problems because they should be our priority for action. I don't want to simply assume that all will be well in the end, and I don't think you should assume that either. People want Trump to be an aberration, the beginning of something that turns out in retrospect to be a deviation from the United States' normal path. But what if he's not the beginning? What if this didn't start a year ago when he was inaugurated? What if it started 10 years ago with the Tea Party? What if it started 25 years ago with Newt Gingrich and the contract with America? What if it started 40 years ago when we began moving from a world in which people with debts had some advantages and protections to a world in which creditors seemed to hold all the cards? Where I come from in Northwest Washington State, rural kids have seen dairy jobs decline, timber jobs decline, mill jobs decline, and refinery jobs decline. Urban employment has grown, but so have urban costs. So where I grew up in rural Whatcom County, kids feel like they have one of two choices. They can stay home and they can have a job around people that they love, but they can barely pay their bills. Or they can move to Seattle and make 3 times as much money, have expenses that are 3 times as high, and live with people they hate. It's not a very happy set of choices. This is what's brought us to this position. This is not the beginning of something. This has been going on for a long time. America's alliances can't get better until America gets better. The country has great strengths, but it needs to share those strengths more evenly. I hope I've convinced you to look closer at the idea that trade, Trump's signature issue, and Germany's signature strength, is the tail and not the dog. The financial flows facilitate the trade flows, not the other way around. And these financial flows, these capital flows, are very, very powerful. They resist a lot of medicine. They resist a lot of cures. So the rules have changed. The low earners get squeezed, inequality grows, investment stagnates, and looks for outlets abroad. When those foreign savings come in, whether from Germany or Switzerland or Korea or Singapore or China, our domestic savings must come down, and they always do, through too much debt or too much unemployment. In a perverse way, Germany's choices 15 years ago to squeeze its workers ended up contributing to us squeezing ours today. Redistribution, as the Germans who do plenty of it have discovered, is less sustainable than giving people the tools to succeed up front. We need much more educational equality. The better off in our society are racing off into the distance, leaving too many others to get by with crumbs. I'm sure this fine university and the work that Rick and his colleagues do could hardly be more important. But education and skills are only part of the solution. People have to be able to towns the cruise ships pass by. We do need fair trade arrangements, but even more than that, the U.S. has to stop being the dumping ground for the world's unwanted capital. We think it helps us, but in a capital unconstrained world, it doesn't help us. This money is not free. It is, under current conditions, not an exorbitant privilege. It's leading us to take on more debt than we should. It should stay home and grow productivity and income in the countries that generate it. So the same goes for Germany on the other end. If Germany wants a better relationship with the U.S., it needs a better relationship with itself. It needs a more equal distribution of chances, which will raise income on the low end, spur more investment, and keep purchasing power at home instead of relying so much on the well-off of other countries to buy goods their own people can't afford. Thanks very much.
Look what I found. 1, 2, 3, hello? Hello, hello? Oh, there we go. We have time for a few questions.
I actually have a few questions, but let me just start with one, that I think is a couple of critical ones. One, you just ended with something that a really big concern for me. You talked about investing, foreign capital investing, and of course, one of the great examples of foreign capital investing is Trump, his whole group. So by that, I don't see any real optimism that he will change that. I mean, he'll make a lot of noise about it, but he's right now, his son-in-law, others are out trying to get foreign investment, including Chinese investment, including things. So anyway, that's number one about that. The second thing I would like to ask you to comment about, and I've got another one, but I'll leave that to somebody else, is that, so one of the things about Germany that I would like to have cleared up, so the quality issue we've heard a lot over the last 25, 30 years. How about, though, do their companies keep their investments at home rather than to send their factories and so on to other countries? So, I mean, the big problem that you didn't mention here is that our elite in terms of our capitalism, have determined that go for the cheapest labor and ship everything out of the country. What you were talking about in Western Washington has to do with that kind of thing that's been going on now for basically since Reagan, and so we've got 50, 60 years of it. And in Germany, I don't think they did as much of that. So there is a difference, and I just like comment to those two.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments. I mean, first of all, the Germans, on your first point about investment inflows, you're right about I think you're right about the Trump team. Manafort was running around Kiev a couple of years ago offering lunch with Trump for $50,000 to Ukrainian industrialists. Oh, why do they want to talk to this guy? Well, it's because it's a conduit into American real estate markets. So there's no doubt about that in my mind. But the Germans are smart about this. They keep blowing smoke up Trump's dress on this foreign direct investment stuff, that the FDI is their answer for the big current account surplus. So yeah, we're beating you at trade, but guess what? We're giving you all the money back again. Right? And again, if you follow the logic of what I'm saying, that's going to have big effects in consumption patterns in the United States, and ones that I'm quite worried about. But the issue on outsourcing is that take the auto sector, German investment at home has remained pretty much rock steady over time in terms of the aggregate amount of investment. So workers haven't been able to say the auto firms have laid people off at home in order to make profits abroad. But there's a couple important qualifications to this. One is the German economy has grown a lot during that time, and it hasn't kept pace with the growth of the economy. So even though the investment levels there's not been disinvestment, they haven't grown the way the economy has grown. And if you follow what I'm saying, it's obvious why that's true. German businesses on balance are worried that people don't have enough money to buy their stuff. And so they're inclined not to invest as much. Now that's part of a global phenomenon. This underinvestment goes hand in hand with a concept called shareholder value, which has had devastating effects on corporate investment in lots of other countries, not just Germany. But I think the premise of your question is basically right. Germans have not needed and wanted to disinvest in their country. It's been enough to not keep up with the investment that's needed. Where that's really pinching, I think, right now is schools and hospitals in Germany, which really need a lot more. It's hard for an American to say they need a better public transportation network because it's better than ours, but lots of other Europeans come there and say, gee, we expected German trains to work better. Yeah, they're at the low end of the OECD in domestic public investment, and that's not where they should be. They should be much higher.
What role do you see the 2018 elections here influence? You think of the Russian meddling in elections, and how much is Germany watching what's going to happen here now with the new elections?
So all the European countries are watching pretty closely. If you go to the Baltic states, they'll tell you, we've been watching the Russians do this stuff forever, and so we're bulletproof. They could invade us, but they can't mess with our media and our public opinion as easily as they could mess with you. And sometimes when you're talking to people from Estonia and Lithuania, it's almost like they're laughing at us for being so naive. The Germans are in a little bit more intermediate position. They had their own very serious hacking issue in the Bundestag. It's not clear to me, it's not open source, what was lost. So unlike with the WikiLeaks thing where everything kind of went on the server, or we think everything went on the server, with the German Bundestag hacking, the fingerprints aren't as clear, although the Bundestag is very confident the Russians did it. And what they got is not nearly as transparent, so it's not quite as clear. On 2018, and what effect that will have, Mary, I honestly don't know. I think that the Europeans will watch it very carefully. When you have, the thing about the Electoral College is that it makes, I'm not accusing anybody of corruption, but as a kind of abstract sense, when you have an Electoral College, if you were inclined to try to manipulate something, that tells you where to manipulate. So in a European-style proportional representation election, let's say I do a massive amount of corruption and I turn this party from 11% to 13%. That might have a significant impact on coalition formation, but it doesn't change the overall complexion of the whole country. Whereas in our electoral system for the executive, you can actually change the entire system by concentrating all of your efforts in one place. Now, that's an abstract point. I'm not prepared to back all that up with data, but it does suggest that in a legislative election in the United States, it's much, much harder for outside agents to get the kind of result that they might want. I happen to believe that Russia did meddle deeply, but did not expect and did not intend for Trump to become president. I just think they wanted to do what they've been doing all over Europe for the better part of a decade, which is to try to mess with the democratic system and to try to bring down people's confidence in democracy. Because after all, that's a fundamental part of Russian grand strategy, is to make the peoples of the democratic West lose confidence in their own system. I just think that's fundamental to when Putin gets up in the morning, I think that's one of the first things he thinks about every day. Call me cynical, but that's what I see.
I think we have time for one more.
You mentioned this change in current account surplus went back to 2003, and what was that related to? Is that the adoption of the euro, or what? Can you talk on that more?
Yeah. So the current account surplus doesn't grow because of the euro, but it gets to grow bigger because of the euro. So let me take those two things separately. It grows because German institutions and policies are changing. They're squeezing, with their tax law, their wage deals, and a couple of other things, they're squeezing the lower end of the workforce. And what that has the effect of doing is subsidizing the capital exporting the exporting industries, okay? And as a consequence of Germans themselves not being able to afford as much of their own production, they're in a pretty serious recession at this point. They're the so-called sick man of Europe. They're sending more and more of that production abroad. And the savings that they're accumulating, especially corporate savings, that are not being invested, that gap is flowing to countries like Poland, Lithuania, Greece, Italy, Spain, and they're able to use that capital to generate a kind of boom condition there. That boom condition ends up sucking in a lot of German exports, cars and other kinds of things, which expands the German current account surplus. Now, normally we think of that as having a kind of fairly immediate limit. The way to think about that is if everybody in this room wants to buy German cars, we all need the euro to do that. And so we all have to go buy some euros so that we can buy our German car. And everybody knows that when the demand for something goes up, the price of it goes up. So now the price of the euro goes up. And now German cars have become more expensive because all of us wanted to buy a German car. As a consequence, that would bring down the current account surplus because the currency got bigger. Where the euro comes in is that now that Germany is together with 15, 16, 17 other countries, the number changes over time, there's no automatic adjustment like that. The euro is being pulled down because of the difficulties of the euro crisis. As the problems in Greece grow bigger, the currency grows softer. Since German cars are denominated in euros, that makes them cheaper everywhere else. So as Greece basically burns, German exports are going up. That's why there's so much anger between the Greek population and the German population. It's not well understood how those mechanisms work, but there's a kind of sense that somehow they're connected. So the euro actually made the size and duration of the German current account much more possible, even though the causes of it were not the euro per se, but domestic policy choices the Germans made. Does that make sense? That's what happened.
We can actually do one more before we take a break.
Thank you. I hope it's a short one. In your talk, it seemed that there are two important parties here, United States and Germany.
Yeah.
But really there are at least three, United States, Germany, and the European Union, which negotiates trade as a bloc. And within the European Union, there's been a lot of talk about the stronger France with Macron and how that might affect German economic policy and policy toward euro, etc., etc. So could you please comment on that, the effect of the Franco-German relationship and particularly French position on euro on the German-American relationship?
So yeah, it's very important to point out that European trade deals happen through the European Commission, not through national negotiating teams. So this is relevant for the Brexit deal, for example, because the UK says, well, we want to negotiate better trade deals with the rest of the world. And one of the first things they have to do is train a whole bunch of trade negotiators, because all of the British trade negotiators, there weren't British trade negotiators. The European Commission did that for them. So what I think is that you guys heard about TTIP last night from Kurt, this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership that never made it. One of the weird things was why it didn't make it. The Germans, more than anybody else, sort of said no. It had to do with digital to a certain extent. It had to do with investor protection rules to a certain extent. Germans kind of are very skeptical about more trade. And I think the answers from an economist's perspective are pretty straightforward. Trade deals always create losers. Economists don't want to tell you that because they want to stress the other part of it. They also create winners. In fact, they create enough winners that they ought to be able to compensate the losers for having lost. The problem is we don't do that very well. And the corollary is that when you start out in a world with high trade barriers, as you shrink them, it creates a lot more wealth and relatively fewer losers. The smaller the barriers get, the bigger the pile of losers is, and the smaller the pile of winners is. And so as a consequence, this TTIP thing, I think, is really an indication that we tried one too many rounds of trade liberalization, that we were not able to get that because basically voters on both sides of the Atlantic said thanks, but no thanks. So finally to France, where does that leave him? Macron, I think, is an exciting opportunity. He's had a really up and down ride so far as president. His popularity crashed, and then it went back up again in the fall, and he's had strikes all week this week. The German response to Macron has been positive but cautious. The coalition agreement certainly carves out a couple of Macron's favorite things and says we could try to move toward that. Turning what's called the European Stability Mechanism into something called a European Monetary Fund, moving farther on banking union, and honestly trying to make sure that there's more investment in the south of Europe. These are all things that Macron has emphasized as being sensible. I think all three of these things are indeed sensible, and I suppose it's possible to get a better management of the European monetary area with better Franco-German cooperation over maybe the next year or so. On balance, I worry that that's not going to be enough. I share Kurt's assessment from last night that if there were another big crisis today, it's hard for me to see how the Europeans would manage it. Right now, because there's lots of quantitative easing and lots of central bank purchases of assets, there's quite a bit of liquidity being pushed into the system. There's quite a bit of growth relative to the last 10 years. So people aren't so worried about that. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, a year from now when quantitative easing ends, supposedly around Christmas time this year, what's going to happen then? And I think that bears a very close watching.
Thank you again very much.
That was Brigham Young University's Dr. Wade Jacoby discussing U.S.-German relationships, why they're grim, and how we can make them worse. The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, presented the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World, with support from AEL&P, Kerr Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, the Prospector Hotel, and Wastman and Associates.